Again, good morning, and I'd like to invite you, if you want to follow along, you can go ahead and be turning in your Bibles to the book of Genesis and chapter 1. We're going to spend most of our time this morning making some observations from chapters 1 and 2. And so if you want to go ahead and be there with me, we'll be able to read there together. It is very enjoyable to me to get to be with you. I always enjoy getting to meet new people. I have, for the last several years, sort of capped off that study in California with a visit to David and his family. And just because they moved, I didn't see any reason to stop doing that. So now I'm just getting to pass through this part of the country. And so excited to get to spend a little bit of time with you this morning. I want us to start off, though, by maybe thinking about some of the unusual behaviors that people do and why they engage in those behaviors. I have an older brother, and so it's not uncommon if you have an older brother to think that your older brother's weird. My older brother takes the cake. He just moved from San Diego to Washington, D.C., and I knew that the first thing that he was going to do when he got there was get a brand new crock pot and 10 pounds of pinto beans. And that's pretty much my brother's exclusive diet, is beans and rice. And if you ask him why, he says, well, I feel like when I eat animal products, it makes me slower when I run. And if you know anybody who considers themselves a runner, they have all kinds of weird behaviors like that. All of the things that they eat or the things that they wear or whatever it is, and you say, well, why do you do that? You say, well, it's because I'm a runner. And so we have these different identities and these different ways in which we sort of define who we are. And if that identity and that self-definition is strong enough, then it informs our behaviors. And so think about that for a moment within the context of why it is that you want to obey God. And maybe some of the normal responses for that would go along something in the lines of, well, I obey God because I feel like I have a debt of gratitude that I owe Him because of what He's done for me. Or maybe I just have an understanding that when I obey God, things seem to go better. Or I believe that if I don't obey Him, there's going to be some bad consequences that I have to face. And those are all well and good. But what about that first notion? That obedience to God is something that can be, and perhaps ought to be, born from our definition of who we are, who it is that you see yourself as, what you claim as your identity. And if you have a certain identity of yourself, what is the responsibility that comes from that? A sense of duty and purpose. And so we're going to look at a few verses in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 that are familiar to you, I'm sure, but then try to make a few implications from those passages. In Genesis chapter 1, we're going to start off reading Genesis chapter 1 and verses 26 and 27. And as we read this, I want you to think about the idea of intention. Verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. I think we would all understand that repetition carries with it a communication of importance. And so if you were a child, the more that your parents have told you to do something, the more you understand that they really expect it to be done. And in any sort of venue, whether we're thinking about maybe our workplaces, the more times we've been informed of a fact, the greater the degree of responsibility comes with it, because we've been told so many times. And in these two verses, there is an awful lot of repetition about the creation of mankind. In fact, I see at least 5 statements that are made. 4 of them are almost exact repetitions of each other. And then there's one in the middle that we'll talk about in a little bit, which is, to me, just a poetic restatement of what the other verses are already saying. But they communicate something. These verses are trying to tell us something. One of the great questions or enduring discussions that all cultures wrestle with, but especially our cultures, as they become more untethered from religion, from a sense that there's something greater than us out there. One of those questions is there a purpose or a meaning to your life? Are you here by accident? Is it just all the result of different random processes and all of this cosmic dust sort of gathering together? Or are you here for a reason? And it won't take us long to consider which of those two points of view, accident or purpose, holds the most amount of influence or sway in the culture that we live in. You just think about the United States at large. And I don't just mean in the sense of, well, what is someone going to say in a science textbook or this philosophical bestseller, or what are they saying on the college campuses? I mean, what are the messages that are behind most of the media that's put out? So books, entertainment, music, television, all the things that inform daily life. Well, I believe that what is most often communicated is that life in and of itself is without meaning, that you are here by accident, and it's really sort of up to you to figure out what to do with things now that you're here. And I think that is at least part of the reason why when we talk to people, they feel very adrift and unmoored in their lives. I don't know if you'll know any of these authors. If you're like me, you probably haven't read too much by them, but I think here's a good handful of quotes that are behind some of our cultural voices. The author Virginia Woolf says, there is no profoundest reason, truth, or meaning in the universe. All is accident. The philosopher Franz Kafka says the meaning of life is that it stops. And the more recent years, sort of the popular atheistic scientist Richard Dawkins stated, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, again, those are probably not the people that you're reading every day. They're not the people I read every day. But sometimes we have to stop and remember that the people that we do hear from today, they get their ideas from somewhere. They are informed by something. And most of what's being put out now is created from a worldview that is informed from people like these. Which, you may have noticed, that's not a particularly positive or upbeat message. Like, that's not something that if you're trying to get people to join your organization, you put on the billboard on the side of the interstate. Life is meaningless. And you have a little smiley face emoji. And so, being cognizant of the fact that maybe is going to cause them to lose their audience fairly quickly, there's a follow-up lie to the lie. And that is the fact that life has no meaning is actually good news. because now it is full of possibility, and you can just kind of do with it whatever you want to. You're free to make of life whatever you see fit. And in fact, if that doesn't sound like good news to you, it's just because you're not mature enough to handle the truth. Again, to quote Mr. Dawkins, he says, "There is something infantile in the presumption that somebody else has a responsibility to give your life meaning and point. The truly adult view, by contrast, is that our life is as meaningless, as full, and as wonderful as we choose to make it." So, if you think that this all sounds depressing, that's just because you're sort of a mentally stunted baby who needs to grow up and embrace the truth. And then you'll be happier, one would assume. Well, when we see people, and I know it varies by region. I live in the sort of central western part of Alabama in a spot that's often called the Bible Belt, because you've got every church of every kind just everywhere you look. And so maybe in some parts of the country there are folks who tend to be a little more religious and thereby informed of some better things, but no place is exempt. And everyone is being influenced by these kinds of things. And so wherever you are, you will find neighbors who need a better path forward because they have tried to live life in this way, and they have discovered that it's a pretty miserable way to exist. Creation implies intention. Now, I understand that there are parts of the sort of avant-garde sections of culture that want to deny this. So, what is the poem that you wrote about? It has no meaning. I wrote it simply for the sake of poetry. Oh, okay, well what is this art representing? I did it just for the sake of art. Well, even then, there's still a purpose behind their creation, and the purpose is to get attention. And so creation, just the act of making something, implies intention. And so what Genesis 1 reminds us of, and what we have to help others see, is that if God created mankind, which we believe to be true, then He has a desire and a purpose for you. In fact, as the Creator, we would say that He has a sense of expectation for what it is that we're going to do with life. Again, we have and can observe people who live in a way that is opposite to that, and it is not a pretty picture. People who find even a temporary sense of comfort or solace in the stuff of this world are still often and usually found that they are only as happy as much as they have the ability to get things. And so these verses tell us, first of all, that we are not an accident, that you were created, and that creation implies intention, and intention implies purpose and concern. But as you were reading through those two verses with me, you notice that they didn't just say that God created you, that God created mankind. There is something even more in the purpose of our creation. 4 times in those 2 verses, it explicitly says, you were created in His image. 4 times. And I would say that even in the middle of that, where it speaks about the dominion and the responsibility that man is given here on this earth, that is just another way of stating that we have been created in the image of God. Because our dominion here is just a small reflection of His dominion over everything as Creator. And so however you want to see that, 4 or 5 times in these verses it says again and again, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Man was created in His own image over and over again. But I want us to look at chapter 2 and verse 7 as it sort of gives us a close-up, scanned-in view of the events of chapter 1. In chapter 2 and verse 7, then Yahweh God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. I want you to think about the intimate involvement that God takes in the creation of mankind. It says he formed man. That is the language that's used of the artisan, the potter, who is forming the vessel. And it says that he breathed life into man. And whatever way you imagine that looking like, I cannot envision it in a way that is not up close and personal. All I can imagine is sort of, God has created the husk of Adam, and then he just, gives him CPR. And, that's the only way to get breath into the nostrils of this man. But think about that kind of intimacy and the involvement in the creator of the creation. For this trip, I rode my Harley, parked out there in the parking lot from Alabama to San Diego. And the week before that, my brother, who, the Pintos and the Crock-Pot guy, said, you know what, my office in D.C. is 100 feet away from my job, so I've got a car. If you want it, you can have it. Just come out here and get it. So a week before I went across the country again in a 2017 Nissan Versa 5-speed manual, which is kind of like Shaq trying to get in that tiny Buick. And so as you go across, I'm stopping at every gas station there is, and I just want to find something unique to be able to take home and say, here I was in, this town and this state, and here's something that they made. But you know what all of those gas stations have? If I'm going through Texas, here are 80 different colors of the same porcelain cactus. And then I get into New Mexico. Here are 80 different colors of the same porcelain cowboy boot. And every one of them, you pick it up and, made in China. All right. So all of that stuff, it has no connection to the place, because it was cranked out en masse in some factory somewhere, and it has nothing to do really with the culture and the people, and there's no mark or imperfection of an artist. There's no maker's mark stamped on it. And then you compare that to the opportunity where you can go to somewhere, maybe a festival, maybe there's a local business, and here's a product that's handmade. And it reflects the culture and the values of the people and the place where it was formed. And everywhere you take it, it serves as a reflection of the place from which it originates. There is that kind of intimacy and God's involvement in the creation of mankind. Even though there's, 8 billion plus people now, we're not cranked out in a factory. You are designed. You are created with care, with purpose, and intention. We're at the tail end now of the college football season, which from where I hail from, it's that's the highlight of the year, followed by crushing disappointment. But leading up to it, you hear all of these interviews, and it's, I'm going to the Rose Bowl, and it's just such an honor to be a part of this storied tradition and to play on the same field as this fella and that fella. Think about that sense of participation, a sense of legacy, that you're not just here by accident, that there's a legacy that you are upholding as someone created in the image of God. Sometimes people talk about positive affirmations, self-affirmations. I think it was, I don't know, it was somewhere in Louisiana. But I was checking into the hotel and the lady said, "Oh, here, I want you to take an affirmation from my bag of affirmations." And I pulled out a little cartoon dumpster fire with eyeballs, and on the inside it said, "Not thriving, just vibing through the flames." So, this is my affirmation. Okay, I can get up, I can face the day. And usually affirmations, whether they be in, questionable cartoons that come out of a stranger's bag or a tear-off calendar, are similar to that. There's not much depth to them. It's fairly shallow. But this text gives us an affirmation with which to begin every day that informs and shapes how the day unfolds. You were made in the image of God. You carry the image in your person of the Creator of the universe. I think we talk about that the world needs this, but sometimes I think that is a reminder that God's people need as well. That life is not just what we make of it, that God has expectations for us. God had expectations for Adam when he gave him dominion of what to do in the garden. And I realize that our expectations are not exactly the same as what Adam had, but the principle is there, that as God's creation, he has something intended for us to do. Maybe you remember the conversations that Jesus would have with the Pharisees in his day. And he would try to teach them, and they would say things to him like, "Well, we don't need you to teach us, or we don't need to be delivered, because we are children of Abraham, and Abraham is our father." And what Jesus would respond to them, and what people like Paul would write through the Spirit in places like Romans chapter 9, is that just because you are physically descended from Abraham, that doesn't mean that you're really a child of Abraham. In the same way, it is a true statement that everyone is created in the image of God. Richard Dawkins is created in the image of God. And Franz Kafka and Virginia Woolf and everyone else, they're all created in the image of God. But not everyone lives in the image of God. And that's what we are trying to do when we come together and we learn and we encourage and we worship. We are equipping each other to be those as Christians who live in the image of God in the truest sense possible. Compare what we read in Genesis 2 and verse 7 about God's creation of man to what Paul writes in Ephesians 2 and verse 10. "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them." Or think about that image message that's repeated again and again in verses 26 and 27, Ephesians 4:24. "And to put on the new man, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth." I think that those are powerful images, because what we are trying to do, what we're given the opportunity to do in Christ, is to fulfill this great legacy of living lives as those who have been created in the image of God. to know that our lives are not without meaning. They are driven by a purpose. And that each of us, as we live our lives, we are communicating something about who God is. If we are living as people created in the image of God, then we say true things about who God is to our neighbors, because we're accurately reflecting His image. If we're not walking in His ways and in His paths, then our lives are telling lies about who God is. Because again, we don't have a choice in whether or not we bear His image. The responsibility is whether or not we actually live in a way that accurately reflects that image, that legacy as fully revealed in the life of Christ. And so, in just a moment, there's a song that's been chosen to help us to think this morning and to maybe consider some of these thoughts as those who maybe haven't yet responded to the gospel or those who have. But either way, to consider where it is that we stand in our relationship to God and our responsibility to accurately portray His image. If there's a way that you can be encouraged, I know that you'll have the opportunity to let that be known as in just a minute we get ready to stand and sing.